just a little after 12, so we'll go ahead and get started. Welcome everyone. My name is Juanetta Ayers. I'm the Executive Director for Commonwealth North. For the past 40 years, Commonwealth North has provided a nonpartisan forum for citizen engagement in Alaska's most critical issues. Through study groups and public forums such as today's event, Commonwealth North examines issues, provides opportunities to meet and engage with leading policymakers, and develops consensus recommendations to move Alaska forward. Engagement is a key part of our process at Commonwealth North. So during today's program, you can submit your questions via the Zoom platform chat window. You can do that at any time. If you are calling in on your phone, you can text your questions to 907-230-2284. Again, that's 907-230-2284. Please only text in if you're using your phone today. So questions should be specific to today's topic. We do have a large audience today, so we'll have to manage the bandwidth if we do run into any connectivity issues. If you're not speaking, it's always the best idea to preserve bandwidth and turn off your video display while the speakers are speaking. With that said, it's my pleasure now to introduce Terry Smith, who's the board president of Commonwealth North. Terry?
Thank you, Juanetta, and good afternoon, everyone. My name is Terry Smith. I'm the current president of Commonwealth North, and it's been a enjoyable experience, and been with the organization for almost 14 years now. And you know, I can honestly say that this last year has thrown us lots of curveballs, more than we would have normally expected. And so we appreciate your participation as we get on and learn these new technologies, and we've had real good response to Zoom, and we're always looking to make it better. So if you have any ideas, please let Juanetta or myself know, and we will try to make it more enjoyable so that we can build on the success that we've already seen. Today we will present the first in a series of forums Commonwealth North will be hosting over the next several months to provide varying perspectives on COVID-19's impacts on the Alaskan economy, the road to recovery, and beyond. Today's panel includes three Alaskan economists: Neal Fried, an economist with the Alaska Department of Labor Research and Analysis Section; Mouchine Guettabi, Associate Professor of Economics, UAA Institute of Social and Economic Research; Marcus Hartley, President and Principal Economist, Northern Economics. Before we hand the program over to our panel, I'd like to thank the Commonwealth North members who are online with us for your membership and the tremendous work you've done to help educate Alaskans, including our public policy leaders, on those items of public policy challenges that we continue to review and update as we move forward. I'd also like to invite the rest of you, if you're not Commonwealth North members, to help join and support our mission. Now we will hear from our speakers, beginning with Neal Fried. Neal?
All right, can I be heard?
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, good afternoon, everyone. I'm going to fly through these slides really quickly. I probably, again, as usual, have too many slides. I'm not going to provide any forecasts. I know the next two folks are probably going to do that. I'll leave that up to them. I'm going to kind of, set the stage of what things were looking like before this happened, and then share with you some of the data that we have that has come a result of COVID-19. First slide is kind of setting the stage to remind people what things were like just a couple of months ago before this began. You know, we just had come out of one of the worst recessions Alaska had experienced. We had lost about 10 to 11,000 jobs, and then our economy started to slowly, modestly recover in 2019. But something also to observe prior to the recession, like in 15 and 14 other years, Alaska was experiencing very modest growth, and in 2019, our economy was basically sitting where it was back in 2010. You could almost say it was kind of a lost decade. And then, you know, we were looking into 2020, preparing that forecast. And of course, we had a couple of months in more normal months into 2020. And, you know, there were a number of industries were providing sort of some impetus to the Alaskan economy, but one of the newcomers to that, and one reason we thought we would continue to nudge into positive territory was the slow recovery in the oil sector. You know, after losing 5,000 jobs, which is the biggest job loss this industry had ever experienced in our history, we started to see positives occurring in the economy, and those continued for the first 2 or 3 months of 2020. And then, of course, the other industry that everyone was talking about all through the recession, one of the, you know, the positive ones that have been true for quite a while was, of course, the visitor industry. Last year was great. We had an exceptionally good year for the visitor industry, and we thought that would also help nudge us and keep us into that positive territory in 2020. And this is what we forecasted. We forecasted an additional little bit of growth in 2020. And this is where the details were. And, you know, it's somewhat telling. Look at the star player. It was leisure and hospitality. That's your entertainment, bars, restaurants, and hotels. And then oil and gas was one of the other big stars. Basic sector parts of the economy. And we all know what shortly happened to both of those sectors just a couple of months later. And then this happens. One of the best sort of bits of data that really began to illustrate how quickly our economy was being affected by the pandemic were unemployment insurance claims, which is data that's been largely ignored for years and years, and we've had plenty of it. It's just not been that interesting. But now it's become, you know, one of the more interesting sets of data because it reacts very quickly. It comes out weekly. And, you know, just records are set almost every week that this data comes out. You can see basically the story here is, when we're talking about individuals, is that last year at this time, there were about 6,000 to 8,000 individuals receiving unemployment, and now it's 65,000 people that are receiving unemployment. You know, we heard a lot of stories. I need to do this real fast. A lot of stories that sound like a lot of people couldn't get unemployment, couldn't get on. It was a disaster. And that's just so far from the truth. You think about, I'm right across the hall from the unemployment office, and they did a yo person's job in getting this out. They've touched 71,000 people in recent weeks. But, you know, these numbers are really sort of nothing but drama. If you go to this next slide, it gives a little bit about the characteristics of the folks that are receiving unemployment. This is Anchorage specifically, but if you want to look at the statewide, you could just double these numbers. Under claims by industry, I don't think there are any big surprises because this has also happened nationally. The big loser, of course, was food service, but so was retail. And one of the sort of humbling experiences I'm forecasting, you know, we were sitting around with a lot of other economists in February going, okay, so what industries might benefit or at least grow as a result of COVID? And one, of course, was healthcare. And of course, we quickly found out that was not going to be the case. In fact, healthcare got hit pretty hard. And then when we look at Anchorage at a glance, that column, I'm not going to go through all of them, but you can see claims were up for a month by 800%. The average week replacement, that's a little bit misleading. It's 68% of people's wages are being replaced by unemployment. That's looking at overall average wages for the entire economy. But if you look at wage replacement for just the UI claimants, the unemployment claimants, it is over 100%. In other words, most people receiving unemployment right now are receiving more in unemployment than they were in their jobs previous to what happened in their last jobs. Another interesting thing, and the average claim amount is $848. If we didn't get that $600 federal bonus, it would be $248, and that would be state benefits. and that is theoretically going to end at the end of July, the $600. The others will continue. We've already kicked into extended benefits, et cetera. First-time claimants, another sort of new characteristics. The majority of these claimants have never either claimed unemployment before or have not had experience for a very long time. That created extra challenges, obviously. About 28% are with dependents, and they get a nice bonus with dependents. And another interesting thing that happened was typically about a third of Alaska's unemployment claimants are female, and now it's about 50-50 statewide. In Anchorage, it's a little bit higher, and that's sort of reflective of where those jobs were lost. That's food service, retail, healthcare, which are predominantly women. So that was a big switch as well. Here's one of those other pieces of drama. We basically went from the lowest unemployment rate Alaska had ever experienced in March or February, and that's looking back to the 1970s, to the highest unemployment rate that we had ever experienced at 13.7. Now this represents theoretically everyone who's unemployed, not just people that are receiving an unemployment check. This to me, I think, is maybe the most telling numbers, and that is the job losses by industry, 42,000 jobs lost. These are estimates that certainly will be revised and revised over. We all know it's actually more challenging to produce this data now than it was just a couple of months ago for a lot of different reasons I can't go into. But you can see the industries and how many jobs are lost. Leisure and hospitality, of course, lost almost half of their jobs. Now, new numbers, both on the labor force, and these types of numbers will be out this Friday for May, for those of you who can't wait to see the next set of data. So that's what this looks like. And basically, the April number, the April 2020 number, is equivalent to the April 2001 number, which was a long time ago. This is sort of an unfair comparison, mixing apples with oranges, but these are the 4 previous recessions Alaska's experienced. And this is what happened in April alone. Now, obviously, when the year is over, it's not going to, the number of losses are not likely to be nearly this large, but it gives you some kind of strange perspective on our economy. Here's real estate that people always wonder about. The first quarter looked pretty good. Actually, there's not enough data out to really tell us, but May is showing that, 50% decline in sales in condos, a decline in single family, but 1 month's data is not good enough. So I think we're going to have to wait to see what happens there. The other thing, besides closing our economy down, shutting it down, or part of it, or consumer confidence is, the timing of this is lousy for Alaska, and I think puts us in maybe a tougher spot than a lot of other states. And what I mean by there is Alaska has the most seasonal economy in the United States. We sit out there by ourselves when it comes to that. And the problem with that is the timing and the fact that a lot of folks and a lot of businesses earn a majority of their earnings during that short period of time in Alaska between May and September, and that often supports other economic activity that's taking place from January to April and October through December. And we know that, the visitor industry is probably largely lost in some of the other sectors too, but let's just look at some of these, what the potential is. This is just sort of a conglomeration of what you'd mostly consider visitor type industries, by month. And you can see that, during the non-visitor months, we have about, 4,200 to 4,500 people employed in those sectors, and then it goes up to 23,000. What's going to happen to those 18,000 jobs? How many of them are not going to appear? So as we move into June and July, it's not necessarily how many jobs we're going to lose. I don't think that's going to be the big story. The big story is going to be how many jobs are we not going to gain that we normally do? Because remember, those job gains that we see during the summer months support those other months on the shoulders. And it's not just the visitor industry that does this. This is a combination that shows you one little slight silver lining in the seasonality is A lot of these workers are non-residents. Seafood processing is going to be a really interesting one to watch. We know it's going to have some challenges. Maybe Marcus has some real nice insight into what might happen here. Here's construction. We're going to lose some of that activity. I mean, construction activity can take place now just fine, it appears. But some of those speculative projects, particularly in I think the private sector, will not happen this year and will be shoved into the future, or maybe never will occur. The other sort of, not unique to Alaska, but that's going to maybe cause the pandemic impacts a little to be a little bigger, more significant in Alaska than maybe other places. What happened to the oil sector that we're all aware of. You know, here it's a sector that was just beginning to recover and then got hit hard. And you know, we already lost. We estimate we lost about 1,000 jobs in April, and I suspect we'll be losing jobs in May again. And this is also just making that oil revenue picture that was already a monster challenge for our economy a bigger challenge. I never thought I would celebrate $38 oil prices. Now, not everything is bad. You know, international cargo seems to be holding up pretty well, which surprised me somewhat. The military, I think when we look at 2020, we'll see growth as a result of F-35 and deployments coming back to Alaska. The mining industry, in spite of the fact that some of them have some real challenges, are doing relatively well in spite of it. Population is going to be a really interesting one to watch. I'm not really willing to predict it yet, but the Wall Street Journal today had a really interesting article about what the COVID's going to be doing to migration patterns. Because let's remember that the biggest things that affect our year-to-year population changes is the number of people choosing to leave Alaska each year and the number of people elsewhere in the country choosing to move to Alaska every year. And the Wall Street Journal actually has a little bit of stuff about Alaska as a result of possibly of this and some data. And then lastly, I was going to say, just to add some, maybe, I don't know if it's positive, but lightness to this presentation, although I don't think the craft beer people would feel that way. A lot of people are wondering, well, what will happen to alcohol consumption? And it's sort of interesting. Liquor consumption went up significantly. A lot of people were obviously drinking behind closed doors. I mean, a lot of bars and restaurants were closed. Wine consumptions, or sales, I should say, also went up. Beer, big beer, stayed about the same. But boy, craft breweries took a monster hit. And we've all read about this. This wasn't just in Alaska. It was across the country. And then marijuana, the other essential businesses stayed open. Also, it seems to have gotten a little bit of a bump as a result of the pandemic. And those are my comments, and move on.
Okay, thank you, Neil. If you can unshare your screen.
Let's see if I can do that. I hope I can. Oh boy.
I'm going to stop. I'll stop it.
Okay, good.
There we go. Okay. All right. Well, next is Marcus Hartley, and I'm going to unmute you, Marcus. Okay. I think you're still muted, Marcus. Nope, still muted.
Can you hear me now?
There you go. All right, Marcus.
Is there an echo?
Yep. Yeah, a little bit.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah. Yes. Yep, you're good, Marcus. Go ahead.
Can you hear me?
Yep.
Okay, I want to talk about, and you can see my show as well, right, Juanetta? Okay,
Yep.
great. I can't hear anything from you guys at this point because I cut the echo off, but hopefully this will work out. My presentation actually is a little bit maybe off the wall. I'm just gonna be talking about some of the things that we really don't have any idea about. This is our greatest unknown unknown. Let's see if I can move the presentation to the next slide here. Is that moving?
There you go.
Okay. Beware of the unknowns. I don't think my slides are clicking through right now.
Why don't you let me do it, Marcus?
Let me try a different screen here. Can you see my screen now, Juanetta?
Yes.
Okay, now, is it sliding through now? This is Rumsfeld's famous quote. Are you seeing my quote now?
No.
Yes?
No.
Give me a thumbs up. No,
No.
okay. How about now?
Nope.
Okay,
Let me.
shoot. Can
There
you
you
see
go.
it now?
There you go.
Give me a thumbs up.
Yep.
Okay. So anyway, I'm sorry about our technical difficulties here. We'll see if I'm going to get through this or not. Donald Rumsfeld, always a brilliant guy. There are known knowns and things these are things we know. There are also known unknowns. We know there are some things that we don't know, but then there are also unknown unknowns. And those are the things that we don't know. And those are the big ones. Those are the big challenges that we have. And COVID is I'm going to say, our greatest unknown unknown. So I'll walk through my presentation outline, just a little bit about Northern economics. I'm going to then talk about our Alaska REMI model. Juanetta, are the screens flipping through for you?
Yep.
And then how I would model systematic changes to the US resulting from COVID, and then how those national changes affect Alaska in the long run. So a little bit about Northern economics. We're social and economic consultants since 1982. We work in fisheries, natural resource economics, and transportation economics. We did recently finish a big study for Department of Transportation on the ferries. Some of you may have sworn at me mightily about that. I think Juanetta may have been swearing at me some on that particular one. Anyway, we have a model, the Alaska REMI model, which is a long-term model. It's developed with Regional Economic Models, Inc. out of Amherst. They've been doing business since 1980. Very sophisticated, high-end policy models that allow you to forecast out into the future, taking into account various different impacts, policy changes, demographics, that sort of thing. Northern Economics worked closely with REMI to develop the Alaska REMI model, and we have kind of exclusive ownership and access to that model. it's really used as a means to measure the systematic changes to Alaska's economy. And it really is pretty good with that. We've used it to look at the big changes that would happen with the gas pipeline if it were ever implemented. We used it a few times to look at military base changes up at Eielson, for example, and the big change at J-Bear a couple of years ago that was proposed. So it works very well in big picture changes, and COVID is definitely a big picture change. So the model is it's a pretty cool model. It integrates input-output, econometric analysis, a general equilibrium model, and really importantly, it's got a new economic geography, and that's a fancy word for saying it integrates demographics with geography in a very clever way. It integrates all these models and then and a national model as well as a regional model, and allows you to do some pretty cool forecasting. So this model is the REMI agency, the business, is supporting efforts to model impacts of COVID-19, and our presentation is really based on some work by Scott Nystrom of FTI Consulting, who've made this presentation on the long-term impacts of COVID earlier this month. And there's a link to his site or his recording, and it's a very, very nice presentation that he did. And he's given us permission to use his efforts in modeling our impacts. He basically is assuming that because of COVID, there's going to be a 20% reduction in birth rates across the board. And that's kind of surprising, but that's based on, that's based on what we've seen in historic recessions and depressions, that nationally you see a decline in the birth rate. And he's modeling a long-term permanent 20% reduction in birth rates, which is a pretty big impact. He's also, because of the tension and the worry about bringing in impacts of COVID, he is suggesting that there will be a 20% reduction in international migration to the United States. That international migration has all kinds of impacts. Locally, many of our seafood workers, for example, are international migrants. But nationally, that's also a pretty big important thing. And then finally, he's suggesting that there will be a 10% increase in international import and export costs. And so we've taken those key features and have tried to model that in a way that brings it home to Alaska. All the impacts are modeled at the national level, and then we run the REMI model without any local inputs. It's just the changes that I'm going to talk about are all based on these three changes in the national economy and in the demographics and populations at the national level. So, and they trickle down into the regional impacts from these national changes. Anyway, here's the results, the bottom line results. And this is a pretty complicated graph, but the very bottom line that comes down, slanting down to the bottom, that shows that we're estimating, and this is really very speculative, and don't anybody quote me or anything, but these impacts that Scott has suggested happens are leading to up to a 6% change in Alaska's population over the next 20 years, a decline of 6%. If we walk up to the next line, that's the gross domestic product. And you can see the model kicks in 2021, and there's a 3% reduction estimated in our gross domestic product. And I haven't gone out to produce estimates of what industries. This is just a very high macro level look. The light, I'm colorblind, but labor force is the light blue pink line. You can all laugh at me because I am colorblind. I don't know what color that is. But labor force is also dropping down to 2.5% over time. And again, this is a 20-year forecast, very, very much speculative, if you will. The bigger, maybe the most important number for us all there is the employment estimate jumps in the first couple years a total of 3% from the baseline forecasts, and then kind of gradually comes back up to a loss of 2% overall. It's important to note with employment and all of these populations that we are not trying to really capture this local short-term surge that Neal is talking about, that Mouchine is talking about. These are just the kind of, what are the overarching big picture effects that we can expect after the kind of initial bump in impacts is felt. So really focusing on long-term effects and the way that that affects our economy. Finally, and perhaps the only bright spot here, is that because population has declined dramatically and labor forces have declined dramatically, we do get a hit in per capita income, but that recovers by the end of the decade. And by 2030, we would say that per capita income is probably going to be higher than it would have been were there not this great unknown hitting us, which is COVID-19. That's my presentation. Thanks very much. I will dial back in so I can hear you if there are any questions later. So next, I'm done.
All right, our next speaker is Mouchine Guettabi. And Mouchine, the floor is yours.
So, let me see. So thank you for having me. I'm gonna try to build off of the two presentations and kind of just walk you through how I'm thinking about the issue. I think both Neal and Marcus talked about a lot of things that I will mention as well. I am in the middle. I'm towards the back end of a formal economic forecast for the next 2 years. It's not quite ready yet, but I'll talk about how I see things playing out. Don't be scared. It shows that there are 51. I'm sorry. It shows that there are 51 slides. It's just because I have a talk later this afternoon. So I will not be going through 51 slides, but if anybody wants the presentation, I'm happy to share it. So I'll go through this stuff quickly. Neal's already mentioned it. Unprecedented numbers, 118,000 initial claims. We've never seen anything like that. A really important number is that there are 48,000 continuing claims. These are people that are still on unemployment insurance records. That's really, really high. Using seasonally adjusted unemployment rates, it jumped from 5.2 to 12.9. Neal's already talked about how large those numbers are. I'll talk about some near real-time data and traditional data that I've been using that shows spending patterns in Alaska. Spending has been creeping up at a very, very slow pace, but it's been going up, which is really good. I've also been using quite a bit of foot traffic data, novel near real-time data that shows that there is some pent-up demand, that people are frequenting restaurants and bars and going out again. Again, we're still well below the levels in January and February, but it's picking up again, which is a good sign. I think it's important to think about what do we know about the national picture. And there's been about 3 or 4 really good pieces of news over the last 2 weeks nationally. The May employment numbers, Neil said that the Alaska numbers come out on Friday. The May employment numbers nationally came out about a week ago, and they showed a big bump in employment, about 2.5 million job increase relative to April, which is great. Again, we're still well below last year, but there is a big bump that makes a lot of sense. And then retail numbers were extremely positive. I was really surprised at how strong they are. Again, I'll keep doing this dance. Month over month, numbers going forward are going to look fantastic because we've hit such a low that the percent increases are going to be looking really good. But I caution all of you to think in terms of year over year, not month over month, because every time we're going to, I'm very confident we've hit bottom or are very near bottom. And so we're going to be seeing good things happen, but they're going to be happening at a slow pace. And we are not going to get back to the level of employment we were at pre-COVID until at best the end of 2022 or 2023, if everything plays out correctly. I mean, I think that's a fairly optimistic assessment. So let me just tell you what the Federal Reserve thinks is going to happen. The Federal Reserve expects a 6.5% decline in GDP in 2020, and it expects a 5.6 percentage point increase in the unemployment rate. The unemployment rate nationally in 2019 was 3.4 or 3.5. It expects that we're going to end 2020 at 9.3%. That's a 150% increase. If we were to apply that increase to Alaska, that means we end up the year at about 15 or 16% increase. I refuse to go that far, but that's a scary number. And so, I mean, that should give you a sense of what we're looking at. And then, of course, I think both Neil and Marcus said this, the Alaska economy, unlike the US economy, is immensely seasonal, has the oil concern question, and then there are questions about state and local budgets that obviously every state is dealing with. Our issues are slightly different. One of the things that I worry about is as there is more and more pressure on the state, if austerity were to take place, that puts even more pressure on this potential recovery, because a cut is a cut is a cut at this stage, and there is already a paucity of money circulating. And so if you impose more cuts on the economy, that just makes this recovery considerably more complicated. One thing that I really worry about, to be honest with you, is the income cliff. There is a lot of money that's entered the Alaska economy over the last 2 months. If you add up the federal aid, the individual unemployment insurance money, the PPP, the EIDL, it's about $3 to $3.5 billion, depending on what you want to count and what you don't want to count. That's about 7% of the state's GDP. That's an immense amount of money. But one thing that really concerns me in this discussion about the recovery is that those nice unemployment insurance checks, that $600 per person, and yes, there are people that are making more money on unemployment insurance than they would have otherwise. I had estimated previously that basically anybody that makes less than was making less than $45,000 a year is getting more from unemployment insurance than they would have from their job. But that money basically dries up if there isn't a second round of unemployment insurance. So that means demand could potentially completely evaporate. And I think that that's something that's, for some reason, is just not getting as much attention as I think it should, because it really concerns me about this pace of the recovery. So I think that there is consensus. Jerome Powell, the Fed chairman, was talking this morning, and he made this point, and every economist has made this point. It seems very clear to me, at least, that there needs to be more support and a transition that gets us to the other side of this recession, whether it's in terms of work share programs, whether it's an extension of unemployment insurance and keep people on unemployment insurance even if they get a job, or in cooperation or coordination with private sector. There needs to be a lot. The other thing that needs to happen, and needs to happen quickly, is again direct aid to state and local governments, or a relaxation of how some of the money can potentially be used, because that's going to be problematic. We know how much debate there's been in Alaska about what we can and can't use the money for, but there needs to be a decision fairly quickly, because again, a lot of states are already looking at their budgets and those declines in revenues and are thinking cuts. And if that were to happen, then again, we're exacerbating whatever little recovery we may be expecting. Everybody's favorite letters over the last 3 months. I had never heard VU and L as much as I did over the last 3 months. I hate all three of them, to be honest with you. There is no V. It's not happening. I know a lot of people who want the V to happen. And again, I don't want to get wonky, but a lot of the numbers that you're going to be seeing in newspapers are going to look like a V, because they're going to be looking at percentage changes. When we think about a recovery, a V happens when you get back to the level of employment at which you were at pre-shock. That is just not going to happen. I would love for it to happen. That's not going to happen. A U is something that, again, is basically a drop in economic activity. We stay in the bottom for a bit, and then we start climbing slowly. I think that that's more likely, again, dependent on how much aid comes. How short can we stay at the bottom depends on how much consumers spend, whether or not they're comfortable congregating, whether they have money, whether they get brought back to work, meaning how many of the temporary separations actually become permanent, because that's a real concern. If a lot of the temporary separations that we talked about become permanent, then we're basically at that bottom and turns into an L, which we don't want. People have started talking about a square root, where we jump and then stay at some new level, or a W. I don't want to bore you with more letters, but I just think that the idea of a V is really far-fetched for Alaska specifically, especially because of seasonality. So Neal showed his forecast. I think him and I presented 6 months ago or something, and our forecasts pre-COVID were very similar. Pre-COVID, I was thinking that the Alaska economy was going to grow at between 0.4 and 0.7%. Now, an important thing here is Alaska lost 11,000 jobs between 15 and 18, and it was going to take us about 6 or 7 years to get back to pre-2015 employment levels, even in the absence of COVID. And so we were going to be experiencing fairly slow growth. That's not going to happen, obviously. I think that we're going to see double-digit employment declines. I think that there is no doubt about that in my head. 2021, again, we're going to see employment gains. Again, no doubt about that. The question is, how large are those employment increases? And I think that, yes, we're going to get a number of the jobs we've lost this year in 2021, but we're not going to get back everything. 2022, I do anticipate more growth at a slower pace because the level is going to be a little bit higher. But I think by the end of 2022, at least that's what my preliminary numbers are showing, by the end of 2022, we're still going to be short of where we were pre-pandemic. Again, this is baking in things go well, meaning there is no second wave, there is no secondary closures. And as I've said earlier, in all of this conversation, I urge all of you that think about this to think in terms of year over year and where we were last year versus where we are in this year, as opposed to the month over month. Month over month has information. It's just that it does not tell you where the economy is relative to a number that you actually care about. So I'll skip this stuff because Neal's already discussed it, but this graph, I started it 12 weeks ago because I wanted to compare unemployment insurance claims to the recession of 2015 to 2018. We've had 10 times the number of unemployment insurance claims than the jobs that we lost between 15 and 18. Neal's already discussed this. I'll skip it. This is unemployment. This is the unemployment rate. Alaska is the orange line, and the gray lines are the other states. And as you can see, hockey stick everywhere in the country, and we're really no different right there. The seasonality, Neal talked about well, and so I don't want to spend time on it, but look at how much more seasonal we are. So the gray lines, and I don't know how well you can see them, are every other state, and then Alaska is the aberration. July employment is 15% higher than January employment, and obviously that creates issues because many of the jobs that we typically would be creating over the next 3 months are just not happening. And as Neal said, it's weird to say, but a saving grace is that a lot of those jobs go to non-residents. So that's still something that we're all going to have to think about how it affects the Alaska economy. I've talked about this, so I'll skip it. I just want to show you a few slides that describe data that I've been using over the last 3 months to better understand what's going on. So Google Mobility Report, SafeGraph, and Opportunity Insights. SafeGraph is a company that has made data available to academics. They gave us raw data that shows essentially mobility visits to all sorts of establishments throughout the country that gives us a sense of not only are people abiding by the mandates and staying home when the shelters in place were taking effect, but how much pent-up demand is there? Are they frequenting the restaurants that are now allowed to open? Are they going back to retailers? And Opportunity Insight is a fascinating collaboration between Harvard, Brown, and many businesses across the country that gives us near real-time data. I scraped it all that shows small business revenues, the share of businesses that are open, and shows a lot of really useful information. So I'm just going to scroll through it quickly. So this is, for example, showing spending in Alaska. All of it is relative to January. So the orange line again is Alaska, and it shows you what's happened to spending in small businesses. And so as of June 3rd, spending in Alaska in small businesses is 15% less than it was in January. And as you can see, it basically fell off a cliff right before the statewide shelter in place, and then it's slowly creeping up, which tells us there is some pent-up demand. People are starting to spend money again as the reopening happened. But again, the comparison matters. Relative to January, we're still well below that level. And then how many businesses, when we were here, have closed permanently? And that's a big question mark that nobody knows the answer to, because that's going to partially determine how many of the laid off employees are actually going to have a job to go back to. Jerome Powell this morning talked about scarring and a lot of the jobs that are just not going to be there on the back end. And this, to me, tells us this drastic decline in spending is going to determine partially how many businesses were able to hang on to get to the other side. So I'll scroll through some of these quickly. I know I'm getting short on time. So this is apparel and general merchandise. Basically same story. This is entertainment, art, and recreation. Very, very low still. Healthcare is something that's really concerning. It fell off a cliff, as Neal said. It's starting to go up, but our increases are a lot lower than the rest of the country. I do expect healthcare spending to pick up fairly quickly, but of course, with almost 50,000 people unemployed, if people are losing insurance, then they may be delaying procedures, which may explain some of this. I'll show, this is grocery stores. This is foot traffic data in accommodation and food establishments. This is week over week changes. And again, the week over week changes tell the story, right? And so fell off a cliff, started gradually picking up, but we're still, as of May 10th, foot traffic is only 62% of what it was relative to March 1st in accommodation and food services. So the graph looks attractive, meaning things are going in the right direction, but we're still well below where we were before the pandemic. Same thing in healthcare and social assistance establishments. I think I'm going to stop talking and allow time for questions. And again, I'll share my slides because there are 30 nonsensical slides after this. So.
Okay, great, Mouchine. All right, we do have some questions coming in. If you can unshare.
Sure.
Again, for everybody online, if you want to submit a question through the Zoom chat window, you can do that. Or if you're on your phone and you want to text a question, you can text it to 907-230-2284. All right. Just cancel this. All right, we do have a question, and I guess this is for everybody. Does anybody have any data? I swear this is not a plant question. Does anybody have any data on the impacts on the nonprofit sector, particularly for those organizations that might have 500 or greater employees and therefore didn't qualify for CARES Act relief?
Can you hear me?
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, we don't have any data, but I would suggest a lot of those large nonprofits are in the healthcare world, so I suspect some of them have seen significant impacts.
Yeah, I would imagine most of the ones in Alaska that would fall into that category are in healthcare field. Okay, another question is what are the implications for the decline in employment, GDP, and population for Alaska's future over the next 10 years, particularly for state-funded services such as social services, public safety, education, and universities? Mouchine?
This is bizarre to say, but again, we have this very strange economy where population puts a burden on state services. Look, the mechanism by which the state makes money does not necessarily go through individual taxes and individual spending. So obviously, losing population is problematic from a private economy standpoint. But as we know, the two big channels for state revenues are oil and the permanent fund. So you kind of have to unpeel that onion to answer that question properly. But if there are taxes in the state's future and we have 20% less people, as Marcus suggests, then that's obviously problematic. And if you have long-term unemployed people, then there is scarring. Then there is usage of government services that just balloon. We know that Medicaid usage is gonna go through the roof or has already gone through the roof. And we know that we're gonna have a lot of long-term unemployed. So two sides to the question, really.
Okay, another question is, well, the governor has made some investment in child care centers with some of the CARES relief funding. Do any of you have any data or projections regarding business recovery that depends on when or how this child care sector rebounds?
I don't have data on that, but there are a few academic papers that came out over the last couple of months that show that the economic recovery, national recovery, absolutely hinges on child care providers reopening and on people being able to safely put their kids in child care. And so there is some work that's come out nationally that's really good. Whomever asked the question, if they want to email me, I'm sure I can track down the paper.
Okay. I guess for everybody as well, what kinds of data do you think that there will be with regard to the businesses that are not going to be reopening? Are there any data sets out there that you're going to look at for that kind of information in the future?
Well, I mean, I think there's a number of data sets. I mean, one of them, our employment data, particularly our administrative employment data, will shine some light on that whole thing. And of course, bankruptcy data could also be shining some light. And I suspect there's other data out there that will do the same thing.
Yeah, I mean, I think that I think AEDC has a few surveys that they've done. I think surveys are going to become really useful over the next few months to try and gauge the state of business health. But obviously, as Neal said, administrative data is absolutely key.
Yeah, I know the SBA, typically with regard to a natural disaster, says that at least a quarter of businesses are at risk for never reopening. And that's just a ballpark national figure, but it would be interesting to see how that plays out across the country. Another question, let's see if anyone takes the bait on this one. Speaking of oil and the PFD, what are your thoughts on the proposed tax increase on oil companies? Would it hurt or help the state, particularly in the context of the outfall from the pandemic? Okay, no takers.
Yeah, I mean, it's such a complicated question. I mean, I'm not a petroleum economist. I mean, obviously, it's such a hard question to try and answer. But as I've said earlier during my remarks, ideally, you're pumping more money into the economy and not raising taxes on anybody and not cutting anything, right? And so that would be the ideal scenario if the state was flush with cash. The state is obviously facing a different situation, but yeah, I really just don't know enough about the dynamics.
Sure. A question about the end of the payroll protection program and the relief that it's been providing. What do you think it'll do to unemployment at the end of this month and perhaps next? No, they've extended the period for 24 weeks, so.
Yeah. I like I said, I mean, for me, and I'll be quiet after this. For me, the two things that scare me is that as ugly as the unemployment numbers are, they're artificially low because of PPP, because undoubtedly PPP has helped. So one thing that really worries me is if demand doesn't pick up enough, a lot of the businesses that brought people back because of PPP will have to let them go once the aid ends, right? And so, and that's a real possibility, because there are businesses that now really are not making enough money to pay people, but they've brought them back because of PPP. And if we don't vote with our pocketbooks and we don't go out and we don't spend money, and that PPP money disappears, then all of a sudden businesses are finding themselves in almost exactly the same situation we were in 2 months ago. So really two things that are happening that are coming quickly: end of PPP, and then end of the boosted unemployment insurance. And this is why really there needs to be automatic stabilizers. There needs to be a rolling way of thinking about this, as opposed to setting artificial deadlines, because we really don't know how to forecast this thing. And ideally, you keep the help coming as the economy recovers. I think that the Fed has it right. I would rather them do too much than do too little, because the cost of too little is really too high. Sorry, that sentence made no sense. But.
Well, we have one last question that we'll do, and this is with regard to the healthcare sector. With revenue down as much as 40% to hospitals, primary care, and private doctors' offices, and the Blood Bank of Alaska being down over 50% of its revenue with the loss of elective procedures during the hunker down, what do you think the impact on the sector will be over the next 2 years?
I'll just say that before I listened to Mouchine, I was a little more optimistic about the recovery in the healthcare sector. And I would have thought that it might be one of the sectors that will recover the more quickly than others, because the demand is still there. Now, whether the resources are still there or not, it's a different question. It does have that it's always had that impetus for growth as well behind it. So I would say the jury's still out, but I'm not quite as optimistic as I was 15 minutes ago.
I have to say, I mean, as ugly as the numbers look right now, I'm fairly bullish relative to other sectors, just because of the demographics, because of the, as Neal said, the historical demand. Of course, there is that concern about people losing insurance, but I honestly think that it's one of the sectors that's going to recover much, much faster than leisure and hospitality and a lot of other sectors.
Okay. All right. Well, thank you to our panelists for being here today, and appreciate everybody's time. I'm going to toss it back to Terry for any closing comments. Terry.
Very good. Very insightful. Thank you for sharing your time with us, gentlemen. Thank you, Neal, Marcus, and Mouchine, for joining us today and for your presentations. We know that those will be posted to the website for people to walk through and get a little more insight. And if we can also keep the questions coming in to Juanetta, and we will accumulate those and post them on our website as well. Thank you all for joining us today. We enjoy these opportunities to learn and to educate and to think about these very complex topics. And thank you again to our panelists who helped us understand those and put them in context. I encourage you, if you are not a member, to become one. And with that, we are adjourned.
Thanks, everybody.